Welcome along to the final ever episode of Beg, Borrow, Steal. We had an epic time at the club, but we're now in the year 2034. Flying cars are all the rage. We've simmed 5 years into the future to find out how CE Europa got on after we left the club. And I think we're in for a surprise or two. So let's start our tour of Europa with how our final season in charge finished, and we had a little mini recovery after we bowed out of the Europa League at the quarter-final stage to Stuttgart. We lost the next game in charge to Tenerife, but then we went on a little run. We managed to beat Huesca 2-1 before we managed to stun Barcelona in the derby. We didn't deserve to win this game. They should have battered us, but we managed to keep it at 0-0 all the way to the end of the game before a Fabian Lutzi goal very, very late gave us 3 points. And then we beat Levante before beating Getafe on the final day of the season, all of which meant that we did recover a little bit and we surged up the league. So it was another season of qualification for Europe, although it was the Europa Conference League that we qualified for. But we left our time with Europa, leaving them in European competition once more. It means that in our 3 seasons in charge, where we were a top-flight club, we managed to finish 6th, we managed to finish 4th, and we managed to finish 7th. So 3 top-half finishes for a club that we took over in the 4th tier of Spanish football, I think is a decent return. We never managed to win a trophy. In fact, in our time at the club, we only won one of the leagues from the promotions that we got. But we resigned, somebody else took over, and let's show you how their 5 years in charge have gone. So 5 years on, at the end of the 2033-34 season, you'll see bizarrely Erik ten Hag is announcing England squads, but you'll also see that in the list of available job vacancies, Europa is one of them. They've had the same manager for the last 5 years, but they've just sacked him after a poor campaign. They are still a La Liga club. They've been in La Liga for the whole time since we left. And let's have a look at their league positions. So after we left the club, the man that they chose to succeed us was Croatian boss Nico Kovac. Quite the coup for the club, I would say. A 3.5-star reputation, a Continental Pro licence, and some pretty tasty managerial attributes. They stayed in the job for 5 years. They were probably a better candidate for the job than we were at the end of our tenure. We'd reached a 3.5-star reputation as well, but we'd still not maxed out our coaching badges, and we didn't quite have the coaching prowess that Kovac had. But unfortunately, he's just been sacked at the end of the most recent campaign, where Europa flirted with relegation. They ended up finishing 16th. They had 40 points, I guess you'd say 11 points clear of the teams that did go down, but that was the poorest season they had under Kovac's tutelage. Before that, well, they performed slightly better in the season before, finishing 11th. The season before that, they were in 13th. Before that, they were up as high as 8th. That's the record placing under Kovac. And then before that, they finished in 12th place. We'd guided them to European competition in our final season in charge. Kovac kept them as a mid-table side before the most recent campaign, where they dropped into the lower half of the table. But was he any use to them in the cup competitions? We never managed to win a Copa del Rey. Was Kovac the man to get it done? In short, no would be the answer, but he did manage 3 Copa del Rey quarter-finals. We managed to get them to the quarter-final in our last season in charge. We bowed out to Barcelona. Then Kovac managed to replicate that in the next 2 seasons, losing out to Real Madrid and Atletico in the next 2 years at the quarter-final stage. And in the most recent year that he was in charge, he lost out in extra time to Valencia, again at the quarter-final stage. But he did manage to go a little bit further in European competition. In our final season in charge, we qualified the club for the Europa Conference League, and Kovac managed to guide them all the way to the semi-final stage before they lost on aggregate to Arsenal. If we go down the years to find that result, they lost 5-3 on aggregate. But I would say in the first leg, the Europa fans must have got excited because they went 2-0 up early in that game, and they could have been dreaming of going all the way to a Europa Conference League final. Some of our old favourites were involved in this game, Fabian Lutzi and Diego Rosa putting them in the lead, 2-0 up after 31 minutes, before they capitulated in the second half, and then they lost, despite scoring again, when they went to London for the return leg. But a semi-final in Europe, I think, is a pretty good return. But how many of our players have been involved for all of the last 5 years? If we take a look at one of Europa's final games of the season, we'll see plenty of the players involved are pretty familiar to us. Lucas Schneller was our backup keeper, but he is now the Europa number 1. Dynel Simao is still in the back 4, and although he was injured today, Almeida is still one of their regular starting centre-backs. But then have a look further forward on the pitch of their midfield 4. 3 of those players are players that we had at the club half a decade ago. Cordoba, Johnny and Diego Rosa are all still involved, and Tommaso Milanesi is still in the squad as well. But then the strike force has an incredibly familiar look about it. In fact, it's not changed since we left the club. You've got Fabian Lutzi and Brendan McComb, and over the last 5 years, by the way, Brendan McComb has been a bit of a hero for the club, banging in 21 goals in 2 of the campaigns since we left, and proving himself one of the top strikers in La Liga. No international honours for him, still 28, so I think that ship has probably sailed, but he has been an absolute stalwart for Europa during the time since we left. And if we delve into the squad, well, we'll see that there are some other players not involved in match days necessarily that are still at the club. So what a hero Tommaso Milanesi has been. You'll see he's still getting regular first-team football. He's averaging over a 7 when he plays. He's not getting any younger. He's 31 years old now. But what a signing he was for the club. Other players that are still around that we bought in. Diego Almeida, 30 years old now. We picked him up on a free from Barcelona. Again, some of the seasons that he's played, he's averaged over a 7. So he has been pretty good. In that midfield, Diego Rosa was probably another one of the players that was a bit of a stalwart for us. And he's another one that's continued to perform well for them. An average rating of 7.13 in a season where they were in the bottom half of the table. Not a bad little return for a player that cost absolutely nothing. However, since we've left the club, they have been spending money on transfers. Let's just have a look at how much money they recouped from the players that they've sold, how much money they've shelled out since we left the club, and we'll also check in with some of our old favourites to see where their careers went to. So we had barely cleaned our desk at Europa before the club reversed its transfer policy and started spending money. We left the club on the 1st of June. By the 1st of July, they were shelling out the best part of £2 million on a French winger from Metz. £2 million is pretty standard expenditure for Europa over the next 5 years. They never spent too big. The most that they spent on a player was a couple of years later when they spent £4.4 million on another winger, this time a Greek one. He must have been over 30 by the time they signed him, and they didn't get their money back. He left on a free to move to MLS, so I'm not sure their transfer policy has been the best thought through, but that was the record transfer fee they spent. They've been picking up players for under £1 million a lot of the time. Doesn't look like finances have been the most conducive to growing the club to the next level. In terms of transfer fees that they've managed to recoup, well, they got one big one for a player that they signed and then flipped and sold on for almost £10 million. That player was called Pierre-Yves Saint-Martin, a French left-back who they managed to sell on to Barcelona, and he's currently back in France out on loan. But having signed him for £2.2 million, I guess you'd say that's a good bit of business. The other player that they managed to sell for a decent bit of money is one that we helped out with. We bought in Morten Hjulmand on a free transfer. They managed to flog him on for £4.4 million. Beg your pardon, £4.6 million. A good little turnaround when he only spent just over a season at the club. Just to show that we did things with integrity whilst we were in charge, if we head back to our final season, you'll see that the only players we bought in during that last campaign were both on loan, and then in the 7 seasons beforehand, we spent nothing in each of those seasons relying on loans. And remember, the loans we bought in we didn't allow ourselves to pay any loan fees for. Otherwise, we were relying on players that were out of contract at the clubs that they were playing for or had already been released and deemed surplus to requirements. I think taking the club to the top flight with that kind of transfer policy is a just reward for our time in charge. However, the other thing that we did when we left the club was that we left them with some pretty impressive facilities. And our hope was that they might go on to try and produce their own talent from within that might help the club kick on to the next level. The question is, have they had any youth players come through that look like they could be the stars of Spanish football of tomorrow? Well, I'm not sure about stars of tomorrow, but I think there are signs that talent is starting to break through. You've got to remember players like Marcus Cordoba are still only 26, and he looks like he's developed into a pretty decent player who's had a rather good career with the club. 2 seasons ago, he looked like he was back to near his best, getting 10 assists and an average rating of over a 7. But they've also got some players in their first team squad that have come through their youth team. Willie Perez was a player that was coming through when we were still in charge. He's not made first team appearances, but he's played plenty of B team football, and they've got him in their first team squad. Good enough to play La Liga football? I'm not sure, but I think they have other players coming through that might do. They've got a Polish player who is wanted by some clubs. Malaga would like him on a transfer. He's a striker, 20 years old now, came through the Europa youth team, has also made a couple of first team appearances in the most recent campaign. Looks like a reasonable prospect, but at 20 years old, a lot of his development looks like it might already be done. But they do have some younger players that look pretty interesting, such as Victor, only 17 years old now, valued as much as £9.4 million, and looks quite a good technical player. A first touch of 16, technique and work rate of 16 as well. Imagine 3 years in and around the first team, stick 3 attributes on each of these different areas of his game, and I think he could be a player, and he might not even be the best of them. If we dip down into the under-19 squads, we'll find some other talent on their books. Another 17-year-old, Kiko this time, valued at as much as £8.2 million. Another striker, decent personality, very good physicals and very good mentals, some technical work to do, but still plenty of time to develop. And I'm not even sure he's the one that everybody's getting the most excited about, because in their most recent youth intake came through a 15-year-old called Emmanuel Barassa, who is valued anywhere between 13 to 17 million pounds. Now, he's got 5 years at least to develop, and he's already a decent all-round player, maybe as a deep-lying forward or a false 9. If you stuck 5 more points on each of these different aspects to his game, well, you can imagine why some big Italian clubs such as Inter and Juventus are getting a little bit hot under the collar for young Barassa. This is the talent that they're bringing through now. I reckon if you were to take charge and turn this into a youth-only save, you might be able to develop some good players, good enough to go on and challenge Real Madrid and Barcelona. I think that would be a big ask. But certainly, we left the club in a healthy position whereby they can start developing players for the first team from within. But if that's how Europa got on during the last 5 seasons, we've got to start thinking about our next adventure. We're back at the start screen. We've got to decide what leagues we are going to load and what style of challenge we are going to take on. There's one thing you can guarantee. It's going to be a tough one. It turned out that not being able to spend any money on transfers was no barrier to taking a team from the Spanish 4th Division into the Champions League group stages. So we're going to go away and have a think of another challenge that's going to be even tougher this time. And we'll be back very soon for a brand new adventure.